A courthouse stood at the center of the small town, its red brick walls weathered by decades of trials, verdicts, and community debates. Normally, it was just another government building that locals passed on their way to the grocery store, or the diner across the street. But on this particular morning, the air outside was charged with something heavier than routine. The sidewalks were crowded with townspeople who had taken time off work to gather near the courthouse steps, speaking in hushed tones. Their conversations circled around one central, almost unbelievable fact. Inside that courtroom, a 3-year-old girl was expected to speak. For weeks, the town had followed the case with uneasy curiosity. The newspapers never printed the girl's name. Instead, she was described only as the child witness. Everyone knew what that meant. She had seen something terrible, something no child her age should have been forced to endure. Details of the crime were whispered, speculated about in grocery store aisles, and whispered across fences. But what united the town was not curiosity, it was worry. Could a child so young really take the stand? Could she handle the pressure of speaking before lawyers, judges, and strangers? More importantly, could justice be served without breaking her spirit? The courthouse steps felt more like a church on that morning, somber, quiet, heavy with anticipation. Even those who had never set foot in the courtroom before felt compelled to be near, as though their presence mattered. Mothers clutched the hands of their own children a little tighter. Fathers shook their heads, wishing the world could be kinder, safer. Older townsfolk sat on the benches outside, remembering other trials long past, but admitting none had ever felt quite like this one. Inside, the courtroom mirrored the tension. Wooden benches creaked as people settled. Jurors filed in with solemn faces, and reporters positioned themselves carefully, careful not to intrude yet desperate to capture every detail. The atmosphere was thick, as though the air itself demanded silence. No one chewed gum, no one whispered. Even the bailiff seemed unusually careful when he gave instructions. Everyone knew this was not just another trial. It was a moment that would test not only the justice system, but also the collective heart of the community. At the center of all this expectation was a little girl with soft, golden curls and wide brown eyes that seemed far too innocent for the darkness of the case. She was wrapped in. On any other day, she might have been playing with dolls in her living room or coloring pictures with crayons at daycare. But instead, she sat in a small waiting room next to her guardian, swinging her legs nervously as she clutched the paw of a large, steady police dog. The dog, a veteran of countless cases, had been trained to comfort children who found themselves in situations too heavy for their young shoulders. His fur was thick and dark, his eyes watchful yet gentle. To the little girl, he wasn't just a dog, he was her safe place, her shield against the unknown. The town didn't know much about the girl's relationship with the dog yet. That part of the story hadn't been shared. But already, word had spread that she would not walk into that courtroom alone. She would have the dog by her side, and in that detail, the community found a small measure of relief. Somehow, the thought of her hand resting on the animal's fur softened the unbearable truth. She would soon face the man accused of hurting her family. For the townspeople, the waiting was its own trial. They replayed the questions in their minds. Would the child freeze in fear? Would she cry? Or worse, would she be unable to speak at all, leaving the case unresolved? Many feared that the justice system might crumble under the sheer impossibility of asking a toddler to carry such a burden. But alongside the fear was a quiet hope. Children, after all, had a way of surprising adults. Sometimes their truth, spoken simply and without pretense, cut deeper than the most practiced arguments. The little girl's guardian shifted nervously in the waiting room chair, watching as the child pressed her cheek against the dog's head. It was a small gesture, but one filled with trust. The guardian knew the girl was frightened. How could she not be? But she also knew that the dog had become her anchor. Weeks earlier, when the girl had refused to speak to adults, she had begun whispering to the dog instead. The officers noticed. The psychologists noticed. Even the judge, once skeptical about the presence of an animal in his courtroom, had listened carefully to reports of the bond forming between child and dog. Eventually, he agreed. The dog could stay. That decision, though small on paper, meant everything. It gave the child a sense of control in a world where control had been stolen from her. It gave the courtroom a symbol of compassion in a place too often hardened by procedure. And it gave the town a story to hold on to, one where kindness might tip the scales of justice. As the clock ticked closer to the moment of testimony, the sense of suspense grew unbearable. In the gallery, neighbors sat with hands clasped as though praying. Some closed their eyes, others stared at the wooden double doors through which the child would soon enter. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the sound of those doors creaking open. The weight of the trial was not just on the shoulders of the lawyers or the judge. It was on the entire town, a collective breath held in fragile hope. And yet, in the midst of this heaviness, there was a quiet lesson forming. The story was no longer just about a crime, a courtroom, or a verdict. It was about a community confronting its deepest fears while placing faith in the smallest among them. It was about whether innocence could withstand the harsh glare of justice, and whether truth could be carried in the fragile voice of a child. When the doors finally opened, the sound was soft but powerful. The little girl appeared in the doorway, clutching the dog's leash with both hands. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the judge or the jury. Her gaze was fixed on the animal beside her. The dog walked with steady confidence, tail swaying slowly, as if reassuring her that she was safe. The room rose to attention, though no one made a sound. In that instant, the town's breath caught again, not in fear this time, but in awe. Here she was, the child they had worried over, the witness they had doubted. She was small, yes, and her steps were timid. But she walked forward, not carried. She entered the courtroom not alone, but with a guardian who spoke no words, yet gave her strength. And as she climbed into the oversized chair, legs dangling above the floor, the town realized something remarkable. The trial had not even begun. And already the child had changed the room. She had reminded them all of the fragile resilience of innocence. She had shown them that sometimes the bravest people are not the strongest or the loudest, but the ones who face their fears with quiet determination. The town held its breath that morning, waiting for a miracle. What they did not yet know was that the miracle had already arrived. It was sitting in that wooden chair, a small hand resting on a loyal dog's head, preparing to speak truth in the only way a child could. And so, the courtroom waited still, silent, reverent for the voice of a 3-year-old girl who was about to change everything. The courtroom, with its tall ceilings and solemn atmosphere, was not built for children. Its walls, lined with heavy oak panels, carried the weight of decades of trials and judgments. Stiff leather chairs and stern portraits of past judges glared down from the walls, making the room feel more like a cathedral of authority than a place of human compassion. Adults often found themselves intimidated here, their voices faltering under the gaze of the judge's bench. For a child barely 3 years old, it was a space that could easily swallow her whole. And yet, on this day, that very courtroom had been rearranged to make space for someone so small, so fragile, and yet so essential. The usual sense of procedure bent slightly in her favor. The judge had allowed something unusual, something that broke tradition. A large, calm police dog sat quietly by her side. To most observers, it looked like a simple adjustment, a minor accommodation. But for those who had followed the girl's journey into this moment, it was far more than that. It was survival. The little girl sat in her chair, her tiny legs swinging freely above the floor, unable to reach the ground. Her hands fidgeted in her lap before they found the soft fur of the dog resting at her feet. She pressed her palm against his back as if to steady herself, drawing courage from the warmth beneath. Her fingers. The dog didn't move, except for a slow, rhythmic breathing that seemed to calm her more than any adult could. In a place filled with strangers, stern voices, and eyes fixed on her, he was her one familiar presence. From the gallery, the townspeople watched silently. They had expected to see a frightened child, and in many ways, she was. Her small shoulders hunched inward, her eyes flickered nervously between the dog and the tabletop before her. But there was also something unshakable about the picture she created. Here was a child who, by all accounts, should have been overwhelmed into silence, and yet she sat in the witness chair, holding on to the one friend she trusted most. Her innocence, paired with the quiet authority of the dog at her side, carried more weight than any lawyer's arguments ever could. For the girl, the dog had become more than just a companion. In the weeks before the trial, she had struggled to answer questions posed by adults. She would turn her face away, hide behind her guardian's arm, or fall into silence so deep it felt immovable. Words refused to come when the questions were spoken by adults with clipboards, ties, or badges. But when the dog padded into the room and lay down at her feet, something shifted. She began whispering into his ear, soft, almost secretive, but clear enough for trained officers and counselors to hear. No one understood the bond completely, but it was undeniable. The dog did not ask complicated questions. He did not pressure or interrupt. He simply existed in her space, steady, patient, and kind. For a child who had lived through something that stripped away her sense of safety, that quiet, unconditional presence was the only bridge to her voice. Over time, the professionals realized that if they wanted to hear her truth, they had to hear it through the dog. And so, with patience, they allowed the bond to grow until the dog was not just part of her world, he was the key to unlocking it. That was why, on this day, the courtroom looked different than it ever had before. The dog's presence at the child's side was not just a symbol of comfort, it was a necessity. Without him, the little girl might never have been able to speak at all. And the judge, though cautious about breaking tradition, recognized the extraordinary nature of the case. Justice, after all, was not always about strict rules. Sometimes it required compassion. As the proceedings began, the contrast between the adults and the child was striking. The lawyers, dressed sharply in dark suits, carried folders thick with documents. Their voices were trained for projection, their words precise and rehearsed. The judge, seated high above, spoke in a tone that carried authority, measured carefully to maintain fairness. The jurors leaned forward in their seats, expressions set with seriousness. And then there was the girl, small and quiet, with one hand still resting on her dog's fur. She didn't carry papers, didn't wear shoes that clicked against the floor. She was barefoot in her courage, unadorned, untouched by the layers of procedure that surrounded her. It became immediately clear that this was not a typical testimony. The first questions, posed gently by the prosecutor, were met with silence. The girl's lips parted as if to form words, but her eyes fell toward the dog instead. Her fingers twisted into his fur, and she bent forward to whisper something into his ear. To the courtroom, it looked like a secret. To her, it was safety. She wasn't speaking to the adults. She was speaking to her friend, the only one she trusted to hear her truth without judgment. The jurors exchanged glances. Some smiled faintly. At the sight, others shifted in their seats, struck by the innocence of it all. Even the judge, known for his sternness, softened visibly. He did not rush her. He allowed the silence to stretch, as if understanding that for a child this small, silence was not refusal, it was preparation. The dog lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching as she whispered again. She smiled faintly, the first smile anyone had seen from her that day, and then she leaned back. Though her voice was barely above a whisper, she repeated her words aloud, this time to the courtroom. It wasn't much, just a few short words, a fragment of thought, but it was enough to remind everyone in the room that she could speak, and that she would speak, in her own way, in her own time. From that moment forward, the courtroom adapted to her rhythm. Questions were asked slowly, gently, often repeated. She continued to speak first to the dog, and then, after a pause, to the adults. It was an unusual process, but no one in the room dared to criticize it. They could see the transformation happening before their eyes. A frightened child finding her courage, one whisper at a time. The townspeople in the gallery leaned forward, captivated. They weren't just watching a trial anymore. They were watching the fragile process of healing unfold in real time. The girl's voice, halting though it was, felt like the purest thing in the room. Her innocence did not weaken the case, it strengthened it. Her trust in the dog became a symbol of what had been taken from her and what she was slowly regaining. The ability to feel safe enough to speak. In that courtroom, the smallest witness was teaching everyone present something profound. Justice was not just about laws and punishments. It was about humanity. It was about finding ways to protect the most vulnerable while still pursuing truth. And as she sat there, with her hand pressed firmly against her companion's fur, she became not just a witness to the crime, but a witness to resilience. The trial would continue, with arguments and evidence, objections and rulings. But for that one day, the story belonged to the child and the dog. Together, they showed that sometimes the smallest voices carry the deepest truth, and that even in the sternest of places, compassion has the power to reshape the very meaning of justice. In the weeks leading up to the trial, countless professionals tried to prepare the little girl for what was to come. Counselors sat with her in quiet rooms filled with toys, trying to coax words from her with gentle questions. Police officers, with kind voices, offered her dolls and picture cards, asking her to point, to nod, to do anything that might help them understand her story. But time and time again, their efforts fell short. The little girl would shrink into herself, hiding, her face retreating into silence. No matter how kind the adults were, their voices carried the authority of grown-ups. And authority, to a child who had seen too much, was frightening. At 3 years old, the little girl did not yet have the vocabulary to explain the storm of emotions inside her. Words like trauma and testimony were foreign, too big for her small world. She only knew that something bad had happened, and that the bad man was gone, but not forgotten. The memories lingered, confusing and heavy. Whenever anyone tried to talk to her about it, she froze. Her lips stayed sealed, her wide brown eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out. And then, one day, the dog arrived. He wasn't a stranger in a uniform or an adult with a clipboard. He was simply a presence large, calm, and steady. His fur was soft, his eyes gentle. He didn't ask her questions. He didn't lean in expectantly, waiting for her to speak. He just lay down on the carpet in front of her, stretching his paws out comfortably as if to say, "I'm here. That's enough." The first time she reached out her tiny hand to touch his fur, something shifted. It was a small gesture, almost unnoticed by the adults in the room. But for her, it was monumental. She stroked his back tentatively at first, then with more confidence. His steady breathing and unflinching calm wrapped around her like a blanket. For the first time in weeks, her shoulders relaxed. She let out a tiny sigh. Soon, the whispers began. At first, they were soft, hesitant. She leaned close to the dog's ear and murmured words that even the adults couldn't quite hear. The dog, of course, didn't answer, but he didn't need to. He simply stayed, listening in his own way. When the counselors leaned in to ask what she had said, she shook her head and pressed her face into the dog's fur, unwilling to repeat herself. It was their secret, hers and his. Over time, though, the whispers grew clearer. She began to use the dog as her translator. She would whisper into his ear, then, after a pause, look up at the adults and repeat the words in a trembling voice. Sometimes it was a single phrase, sometimes only 1 or 2 words. But it was progress, tiny steps across a bridge, built not by authority, but by trust. The officers were astonished. They had tried everything: games, dolls, even candy, but none of it had worked. And yet here was this dog, unlocking her voice with nothing more than patience and presence. It wasn't magic. It was something deeper, a bond that went beyond words. To the little girl, the dog wasn't just an animal. He was safety. His steady eyes told her that he wouldn't leave. His calm body language promised that he wouldn't get angry, wouldn't rush her, wouldn't demand more than she could give. He was her safe place in a world that had been turned upside down. Day after day, she sought him out. In the waiting rooms, she curled up beside him, her small fingers tangled in his fur. At night, she asked her guardian if the dog could stay, though of course he couldn't. Still, she clung to the memory of his warmth, holding on to it as a shield against the nightmares that sometimes woke her crying. What no one could fully understand was how much she told him, how many secrets, fears, and memories spilled into his listening silence. For her, it was easier to tell the dog than to tell the adults. He didn't ask her to explain. He didn't make her relive things she wanted to forget. He simply accepted what she gave him, in whispers too soft for anyone else to hear. And slowly, through those whispered confessions, she began to heal. The counselors, recognizing the bond, shifted their strategy. Instead of forcing conversations, they worked through the dog. They let her lean against him while they asked questions. They allowed her to whisper into his ear first, then encouraged her to share with them. The dog became the bridge, the translator, the anchor. Without him, she was silent. With him, she began to find her voice. Word of this bond spread quietly among the adults involved in the case. The prosecutor, at first skeptical of relying on a dog for such a critical testimony, changed his mind when he saw the transformation firsthand. The judge, too, listened to the reports with increasing interest. This wasn't just about comfort. This was about truth. The dog wasn't just a companion. He was the reason the little girl could speak at all. In the town, whispers of the bond began to circulate. People who had once doubted the feasibility of a 3-year-old testifying now spoke with cautious hope. "She talks to the dog," they said in grocery store lines, their voices hushed but tinged with amazement. "She tells him things she won't tell anyone else." The little girl, of course, knew nothing of these conversations. She only knew that when she was scared, when her chest felt tight and her throat closed up, the dog was there. He was her calm in the storm. She would press her cheek against his and feel the world quiet down. In his presence, the fear shrank enough for her to find her words. One afternoon, during a particularly difficult preparation session, the counselor asked her gently, "Can you tell us what happened?" The little girl froze. Her eyes filled with tears, her lips pressed tightly together. But then she looked at the dog. She bent down, pressed her lips against his ear, and whispered. The dog remained still, listening as always. After a long pause, the girl sat back up, wiped her nose with her sleeve, and whispered again. This time to the adults. The words were halting, incomplete, but they were there. For the first time she had spoken of the bad man. The room fell silent. No one moved. No one dared interrupt. They all understood what had just happened. The dog had given her the courage to do the unthinkable, to name her fear, to bring it into the light. From that day forward, the bond between child and dog was treated as sacred. He accompanied her to every session, sat with her during every meeting, and eventually was granted the rare honor of entering the courtroom at her side. It was unprecedented, but everyone agreed it was necessary. The bond was not one-sided. The dog, though trained, seemed to sense the gravity of his role. He remained unusually calm with her, more patient than even the trainers had expected. He adjusted his posture when she climbed into his lap, tolerated her tugging fingers, and rested his head against her knee when she grew anxious. To him, she wasn't just another assignment. She was his child, his responsibility. And so, in those weeks before the trial, while the town whispered and the adults worried, a bond was quietly shaping the outcome of everything. A little girl and a dog had found each other in a world that had tried to silence her. Together, they built something stronger than fear. Together, they created a language without words. By the time the trial approached, the professionals were still nervous, the community still anxious. But the little girl was no longer entirely alone. She had her voice, fragile but growing. And she had her friend, steady and true, who would walk beside her into the courtroom. It was a bond beyond words, and in the end, it would carry her farther than anyone could have imagined. The morning of the trial dawned gray and quiet, as if the sky itself understood the weight of the day. A fine mist hung over the streets, softening the outlines of the courthouse, but nothing could soften the anticipation that clung to the town. Inside homes, kitchens, and coffee shops, conversations circled the same point. Today was the day the little girl would speak. At the courthouse, reporters clustered near the steps, their cameras lowered out of respect, but ready to capture the moment. Neighbors who had never attended a trial before slipped into the gallery, their faces drawn and serious. Even those who couldn't make it into the building seemed to feel the gravity of the moment. In a town where news traveled faster than the wind, everyone knew that history was about to unfold in that courtroom. The girl herself sat in a quiet room down the hall, far from the murmuring crowds. Her guardian sat beside her, clasping her small hand. On the other side, sprawled on the floor with calm dignity, was the police dog. He had been her shadow through weeks of preparation, her translator when her voice failed, her comfort when fear threatened to silence her. Today, he was more than all of that. Today, he was her shield. She wore a simple dress, chosen not for its appearance, but because it was the one she had pointed to in her closet that morning. Her hair, soft and slightly messy, was pulled back, with a pink ribbon. In many ways, she looked like any other child preparing for a day at preschool or Sunday school. But her wide brown eyes told another story. They carried a depth too heavy for her years, the kind of weight that comes only when innocence has been stolen too soon. The dog, sensing the shift in her mood, lifted his head and nudged her arm gently. She smiled faintly, rubbing his ears with tiny fingers, as though drawing strength from his calm. For a moment, the tension in her small shoulders eased. She leaned against him, her cheek resting against his fur, and whispered something only he could hear. When the bailiff finally appeared at the door to escort them in, the girl did not stand right away. She looked first at the dog, then at her guardian. Her guardian whispered, "He's right here. You don't have to do it alone." With a deep breath that seemed far too grown up for someone so small, she nodded. She clutched the dog's leash with both hands, and together they stepped into the hallway. The sound of their approach, soft footsteps, and the steady click of the dog's nails on the polished floor was enough to make the packed courtroom fall silent. Conversations ceased, paper stilled, and the air grew taut with expectation. When the double doors opened, the entire room seemed to lean forward. The sight was both heartbreaking and powerful. A little girl, barely tall enough to reach the seat of the witness chair, walked steadily into the room. She did not look at the gallery, nor at the stern faces of the lawyers, nor at the judge seated high above. Her eyes remained on the dog, her anchor in a sea of strangers. The dog walked confidently at her side, his head held high, tail swaying slowly. He moved with the grace of one who understood the importance of his role, as if he knew the entire weight of the room rested on his steady presence. And in truth, it did. The judge, normally rigid in formality, softened his gaze as the child approached. He gave a small nod, not of authority, but of encouragement. The jurors shifted in their seats, some biting their lips, others blinking quickly to hold back tears. Even the defense attorney, who had prepared for weeks to challenge. Her words sat quietly, his pen unmoving on the notepad before him. A bailiff helped the girl climb into the witness chair. The seat was far too large for her tiny frame, and her legs dangled high above the floor, swinging nervously. But she had the dog. He settled immediately at her feet, his body pressed close against the chair, as though forming a barrier between her and the world. She reached down instinctively, her fingers tangling in his fur, and exhaled a shaky breath. The courtroom, already silent, seemed to fall into an even deeper stillness. The weight of the moment pressed on everyone present. This was the day of truth, the moment when the smallest witness would be asked to bear the heaviest burden. The prosecutor began gently, his voice softened from its usual sharp tone. "Sweetheart, can you tell us your name?" The little girl froze. Her lips trembled, her eyes darted to the dog. She bent forward, pressing her lips against his ear, and whispered. The dog didn't move. He simply absorbed her words, his calm presence steadying her. After a long pause, she leaned back and whispered again, this time to the courtroom. Her voice was barely audible, but the silence in the room carried her words clearly. The jurors smiled faintly. A ripple of relief passed through the gallery. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She had spoken. The questions continued, each one slower, gentler than the last. Sometimes she answered right away, her voice growing stronger with each attempt. Sometimes she whispered first to the dog, as though testing the words in a safe place before sharing them with the world. And sometimes she said nothing at all, retreating into silence. But even in those silences, no one rushed her. The judge waited. The prosecutor waited. Even the defense attorney waited. The entire courtroom adjusted to her rhythm, understanding instinctively that her pace was the only one that mattered. For the townspeople watching, it was more than a trial. It was a lesson. They saw that truth could not be forced. It had to be nurtured. They saw that justice was not only about laws, but about compassion. And above all, they saw the extraordinary courage it took for a child so small to sit in that chair at all. As the morning wore on, the tension in the room shifted. What had begun as a scene heavy with doubt transformed into something almost sacred. The little girl, though frightened, was speaking. She was telling her truth in the only way she could, haltingly, through whispers, with the help of her faithful companion. And with every word, the courtroom leaned in, hanging on her voice as though it were the most important sound in the world. When a break was finally called, the girl climbed down from the chair and wrapped her arms around the dog's neck. The gallery, though instructed not to react, could not help itself. Quiet sniffles broke through the silence. Tears rolled down cheeks, wiped away discreetly with handkerchiefs. The smallest witness had spoken, and in doing so, she had touched. every soul in that room. The day was far from over, and the hardest questions still lay ahead. But already, something had changed. The courtroom was no longer just a place of judgment. It had become a place of humanity. And at the center of it all was a little girl and her dog, two unlikely heroes who had walked into the room together, carrying nothing but trust and courage, and reminded everyone of what truth really looks like. The day of truth had begun. And though the outcome remained uncertain, one thing was clear. The voice of a child, however small, had already reshaped the course of justice. The courtroom was utterly still. The kind of stillness that makes every sound, every shuffle of paper, every cough, every creak of the wooden benches echo louder than it should. It was as if the very air held its breath, waiting. The little girl sat in the oversized witness chair, her feet dangling far above the ground, her small hands buried in the thick fur of the police dog beside her. The dog lay quietly at her feet, his presence calm, his steady breathing an anchor against the storm, swirling invisibly around her. At first, it seemed as though the worst had passed. She had walked bravely into the courtroom, climbed into the seat, and even whispered her name. That alone had been enough to move the gallery, enough to reassure the prosecutor that there was hope. But now, as the questions grew more difficult, the child's fragile courage seemed to falter. The prosecutor leaned forward slightly, his voice careful, almost whisper-soft. "Can you tell us, do you remember what happened that day?" The question was simple enough in words, but heavy in meaning. It was a question that cut to the heart of everything. A question that asked her to open a door she had kept closed for so long. The little girl froze. Her lips parted slightly, as though the words might come, but no sound followed. Her wide brown eyes dropped to the dog, searching for comfort. She pressed her hand more firmly into his fur, her knuckles whitening with the pressure. He didn't move, didn't flinch. His calm seemed to say, "It's all right. I'm here." But still, she said nothing. Seconds passed, stretching longer than they should. The jurors leaned forward unconsciously, as though willing the child to speak. The gallery sat rigid, hearts pounding with empathy and fear. The silence grew heavier with every moment, filling the room like water rising in a well. It wasn't just silence, it was the sound of her fear. The judge shifted slightly in his seat. Normally, in trials, silence was an inconvenience. Witnesses were expected to answer quickly, to keep the proceedings moving. But here, no one dared rush her. No one dared break the fragile moment. Forcing her would shatter everything they had built. So they waited. The prosecutor tried again, even softer this time. "Sweetheart, it's okay. You can tell us. Do you remember what happened?" The little girl's throat tightened. Her chest rose and fell quickly, the beginnings of panic visible in her tiny frame. She bent forward, her lips brushing against the dog's ear. She whispered something so quietly that not even the closest microphone could pick it up. The dog remained perfectly still, absorbing her words in silence. But when the prosecutor gently asked, "Can you tell us what you said?" she shook her head fiercely, her curls bouncing as she pressed her face against the dog's neck. The silence deepened. It was painful, almost unbearable. Adults in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, some blinking back tears, others biting their lips. They weren't impatient with her, they were aching for her. They could see the battle unfolding inside that tiny body, a battle too big for someone so small. Every adult in the room seemed to feel the weight of her silence in a different way. The jurors thought of their own children or grandchildren, imagining them in that chair. The lawyers thought of all the words they had spoken in their careers, and how none of them carried as much power as the words this child was holding back. Even the defense attorney, prepared to cross-examine, sat still, his pen forgotten in his hand. The silence belonged to her, and everyone honored it. Minutes ticked by, though they felt like hours. The judge finally spoke, his voice gentler than anyone had ever heard it. "It's all right, little one. You take your time." Still no answer. Her guardian, seated just a few feet away, clenched her hands together tightly, resisting the urge to run forward and scoop the girl into her arms. She knew she couldn't. The child had to do this herself, in her own time, in her own way. But watching her struggle was like watching a bird trying to take flight with broken wings. It tore at the soul. The silence stretched so long that some began to wonder if she would speak at all. Perhaps perhaps her fear was too great, the burden too heavy. Perhaps the justice system was simply asking too much from someone so young. And then, just when the silence had become almost unbearable, something shifted. The dog lifted his head slightly and pressed his nose against her knee, as though nudging her gently back toward the surface. She blinked, surprised by the touch, and looked down at him. His eyes met hers, calm and steady, and she inhaled sharply. Her fingers twisted into his fur, grounding herself in his presence. The prosecutor, sensing the moment, didn't speak. He didn't push. He simply waited. The little girl took another breath. Her lips trembled. Her chest rose and fell with effort. And though no words came yet, there was a sense in the room that they were close, that the silence was beginning to crack. In that silence, something remarkable happened. The courtroom, normally divided by roles and sides, prosecution, defense, jury, gallery, became united. Every single person, regardless of their position, silently urged her forward. The air was thick not with impatience, but with compassion. Everyone understood the enormity of what they were asking her to do, and everyone was willing to wait. Because in that moment, it was clear. Her voice was not just evidence. It was truth. It was courage. It was the fragile sound of justice being born from innocence. The silence remained heavy, but it was no longer suffocating. It was sacred. It was the space she needed to gather her courage. And while no one yet knew when the words would come, they all knew this. When she finally spoke, the entire world would listen. The courtroom held its breath. The weight of days, weeks, and even months of preparation had finally culminated in this fragile, electric moment. Every eye was on the little girl. Her small hands clutched the thick fur of the police dog at her side, and the dog, calm and steady as ever, seemed to sense the importance of the instant. He shifted slightly, nudging her gently as if to say, "You are ready. You can do this." For the child, the challenge was monumental. She had spent countless hours preparing, whispering words into the dog's ear, rehearsing tiny phrases until they felt safe enough to voice aloud. But now, with the eyes of a courtroom upon her, with the weight of justice pressing down, every muscle in her small body trembled with fear. The words, though simple, carried immense weight. 2 words that could change everything. The prosecutor leaned forward, careful not to scare her further. His voice was soft, almost tender. "It's okay. You can tell us. We're listening." Her lips parted slightly, a faint quiver running through them. For a moment, the silence seemed unending. The judge shifted in his seat, eyebrows raised, his usual sternness softened by the gravity of the scene. Even the jurors, who had been trained to maintain neutrality, could not hide their fascination and concern. Every heartbeat in the room seemed synchronized with the girl's shallow breaths. She bent closer to the dog, pressing her lips against his ear. Her voice was a barely audible whisper, carrying a tremor of fear and uncertainty. The dog remained still, his eyes fixed on her, unblinking, unwavering. In that quiet exchange, he absorbed her terror, her courage, her truth. For the first time, the child wasn't speaking to adults or a faceless system. She was speaking to someone who understood completely, someone she trusted completely. After what felt like an eternity, she slowly straightened, lifted her chin, and in a trembling voice, repeated the words aloud. They were 2 words, simple, small, yet heavier than any sentence a grown person could utter. Bad man. The effect was instantaneous. The courtroom froze. Time seemed to slow. The jurors' pens hovered above their notepads. Reporters in. The gallery stilled, holding their breath. The judge's hand paused mid-air, a faint catch in his throat. Every adult in the room felt the force of those words, raw and unfiltered, carrying the weight of fear, pain, and truth. Tears came first for some, quietly at first, then in more obvious streams. The gallery, which had been tense and expectant, now became a place of shared humanity. Even those hardened by years of legal proceedings, those who had seen countless crimes and witnesses, felt themselves shaken. 2 words, a tiny child's voice, had cut through the formality, the procedure, and the polished walls of the courtroom, striking directly at the heart. The little girl's voice wavered, but did not falter. She repeated the words, louder this time, and in that repetition, she seemed to claim a piece of power. Her fear did not vanish, but it became manageable. With the dog's presence at her side, she had found the courage to speak the truth that adults had struggled for months to uncover. The defense attorney's face softened too, though the professional mask remained. He had been prepared to challenge, to scrutinize, to question every hesitation. But he could not challenge the innocence of those words. They were a child's truth, spoken without pretense, without motive, without manipulation. They were pure, and they pierced the courtroom with undeniable clarity. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair, a rare moment of emotion breaking through his otherwise composed demeanor. He understood the significance. Those 2 words were not just testimony, they were the manifestation of courage, of survival, of resilience. The child had spoken the unspoken, and in doing so, had given the courtroom something more valuable than evidence: authenticity. The jurors, many of whom were parents or grandparents, shifted in their seats, visibly affected. They could feel the weight of the girl's experience, the fear she had carried, and the bravery it took to give voice to it. They were no longer passive observers. In that instant, they were participants in a moment of profound human truth. The little girl, sensing the effect of her words, pressed her hand more firmly into the dog's fur. His steady presence reassured her, reminding her that she was not alone. She looked up at the judge, then at the jurors, then back at the dog. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, a mix of relief and continued apprehension. She had done it. She had spoken. The courtroom remained quiet for a few seconds longer, as if honoring the gravity of what had just occurred. Then the prosecutor, his own voice soft with emotion, said, "Thank you. That's all we needed to hear for now." The words hung in the air, almost ceremonial. They weren't just a procedural acknowledgement. They were a recognition of courage, of innocence, preserved even in the face of fear, of a child's voice, delicate yet powerful enough to move grown adults to tears. Outside the courtroom, news of the 2 words spread quickly. Neighbors, friends, and community members whispered to each other, their voices low with reverence. In a town accustomed to small, quiet lives, this tiny act of bravery became something monumental. People marveled at the simplicity of the words and the extraordinary courage behind them. "She said it," they repeated. Just 2 words, and yet they changed everything. The dog, sensing that the moment had passed, shifted. Slightly at her feet, but remained close, protective, and calm. The child reached down to hug him, pressing her cheek against his head. In that embrace, the courtroom witnessed a bond that went beyond duty, beyond training, beyond any ordinary relationship between human and animal. This was trust in its purest form. For the little girl, the act of speaking was liberating. Though fear still lingered, the paralysis of silence was broken. She had confronted the moment she had dreaded most, and had found that her words, though few, had power. She had not only told the truth, she had claimed it. And in doing so, she became not just a witness to a crime, but a symbol of resilience and courage. The gallery, still holding back tears, began to exhale. The collective tension that had gripped the room slowly eased. Yet everyone knew that the trial was far from over. More questions awaited, more explanations, more procedural steps. But the hardest part, the moment that had terrified everyone, had passed. The two words echoed in the minds of everyone present, long after they were spoken. They were a reminder of the fragility of innocence, the strength hidden within vulnerability, and the profound impact a single voice can have. They were proof that courage does not always come in long speeches or grand gestures. Sometimes it comes in small, trembling words, spoken with all the honesty a child can muster. As the session concluded, the girl stood slowly, aided by the dog's reassuring presence. She held onto him tightly as the bailiff helped guide her out of the chair. Her guardian followed close behind, smiling with relief, proud beyond measure. For the first time that day, the weight on her tiny shoulders seemed lighter. The courtroom emptied slowly, each adult carrying with them a memory they would not soon forget. They had witnessed something extraordinary. A moment where innocence, fear, trust, and courage intersected in a way that transcended procedure and law. Two simple words had reminded them of humanity's core, and no one present would ever see the courtroom or a child quite the same way again. In the quiet moments afterward, the dog rested his head on her lap, eyes steady, almost knowing the monumental role he had played. The little girl stroked his fur gently, a soft smile breaking across her face. She had found her voice, her courage, and her safety. And in doing so, she had given the entire courtroom a lesson in what it truly means to be brave. Those two words, uttered softly, spoken by the smallest witness in the largest courtroom, had left an indelible mark. They had broken the silence, reshaped the energy of the room, and created a moment of human connection that would be remembered long after the trial's conclusion. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law. It had transformed into something more intimate, more human, a chamber of empathy, of shared vulnerability, of recognition that courage often comes in the smallest of packages. The words had been spoken softly yet powerfully, two words that carried a lifetime of fear and a glimmer of hope. The phrase, "bad man," hung in the air, and the room seemed suspended in time, as if the building itself had absorbed the weight of what had just occurred. Every person in the room felt it. The jurors, who had been trained to maintain neutrality and distance, were visibly shaken. Their pens, which had hovered over notepads in anticipation, now rested idly as their hands shook slightly. They exchanged glances that spoke volumes, no discussion needed. They had witnessed bravery that transcended age, intellect, and expectation. They had seen a tiny child do something no adult could have done so effortlessly: confront fear and speak the truth. The gallery, packed with townspeople who had come from all corners of the community, was equally affected. Mothers and fathers, holding their own children close, blinked rapidly to keep tears at bay. Grandparents whispered soft prayers of thanks and relief, their knuckles white against wooden railings. Even seasoned reporters and photographers, tasked with capturing the moment, felt their professional detachment crumble. They did not rush to take notes. They did not click cameras. They simply observed, humbled by the raw authenticity of a child's courage. The judge, normally the embodiment of stoic authority, let his hands rest on the bench, his stern facade softened. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried an unusual weight. Let us all remember the bravery it takes for the smallest among us to speak truth in the face of fear. This child has reminded us that courage is not measured by size or age, but by the heart. The little girl sat quietly, her hands clasping the dog's fur tightly. She had not yet fully processed the reaction she had sparked. She only knew that the room no longer felt as frightening. The people who had seemed so distant and intimidating now appeared compassionate, their energy gentler. And the dog, lying calmly at her feet, sensed the shift as well. His eyes softened, his tail thumped lightly against the floor, a subtle rhythm that seemed to communicate approval and comfort. The defense attorney, who had been preparing to challenge every hesitation, looked down at his notepad and realized he had nothing to argue against. The words were simple, but their authenticity rendered any procedural maneuvers meaningless. He folded his hands, silently acknowledging that the child's innocence had done what law and argument could not. It had pierced the hearts of everyone in the room. The prosecutor, a man hardened by years of trying cases, felt his throat tighten. He had handled countless witnesses, heard countless confessions, and argued thousands of points in courts across the state. But nothing had prepared him for this. He glanced at the child, then at the dog, and realized that the evidence he had feared might be difficult to present had already spoken for itself. The truth, coming from this small voice, needed no embellishment. Even the bailiffs, tasked with maintaining order, felt the impact. They stood silently, their usual brisk movements slowed as though gravity itself had changed. They had witnessed many testimonies, some harrowing, some mundane, but none had moved them like this. They exchanged quiet glances with one another, unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. Something profound had happened here. Outside the courtroom, the hum of the town carried the story. People who had not been able to attend waited by the courthouse, leaning against railings, craning their necks to catch glimpses of those leaving. They had heard whispers, rumors that this child, so small, so young, had spoken 2 words that left grown adults in tears. Mothers clutched their children tighter, imagining the courage it took. Fathers shook their heads, silent in awe. And those who had lived in the town for decades remarked to one another, quietly, that they had never seen bravery like this in their lives. Back inside, the silence continued to settle over the courtroom. It was a quiet, reverent silence, different from the tense stillness before she had spoken. It was a silence of recognition, of empathy, of understanding. It was as though everyone in that room had been reminded of something essential, that courage, truth, and humanity are often most visible in those we least expect. The little girl, sensing the shift in the room, exhaled softly. She let her hands rest in her lap, still touching the dog, and looked around at the people whose eyes were on her. Some faces were wet with tears. Others were pale, but their eyes shone with a kind of awed respect. And for the first time that day, she allowed herself a small smile. Not a smile of triumph, not yet, but a smile of relief. She had spoken. She had been heard. The dog, sensing her confidence, nudged her hand with his nose. She giggled softly, a sound so light and unexpected it seemed almost magical against the heavy atmosphere of the courtroom. A few people in the gallery smiled faintly in response, surprised by the innocence and purity of the sound. Even those who had been hardest to move, those steeped in the mechanics of law and justice, felt their hearts stir. The judge called for a brief recess, allowing everyone to collect themselves. In the hallways outside, murmurs spread quickly. She said it. She spoke. She wasn't afraid. People who had arrived nervous and skeptical now shared quiet nods and whispered words of admiration. The child's courage had become a symbol, a beacon that reminded the community of something they often forgot in the bustle of everyday life. and even the smallest voice can have immense power. During the break, the little girl leaned against her guardian, still clutching the dog. She did not fully understand the magnitude of what she had done, nor did she need to. For her, it was enough that she had been brave, that she had spoken the truth, and that the dog had stayed beside her every step of the way. The bond between them had carried her farther than any adult's instructions ever could. Outside the courthouse, townspeople lingered, speaking quietly among themselves. Parents told each other that they hoped their own children could one day display such bravery. Neighbors reflected on the fragility and resilience of innocence. And those who had felt helpless in the face of the crime found solace in the reminder that courage can emerge even in the smallest, most vulnerable among us. Inside, as the trial prepared to resume, the atmosphere had changed. There was a reverent energy in the room, a recognition that what had just occurred transcended procedural boundaries. Everyone, judges, attorneys, jurors, gallery members, understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. A child had spoken, and in doing so, had moved the hearts of everyone present. The dog, ever faithful, rested his head gently on the child's lap as the proceedings continued. He had been her anchor, her protector, her bridge to the world. And now, as the trial moved forward, it was clear that his presence had done more than comfort her. It had facilitated truth itself. The day, the trial, the case, none of it would ever be forgotten. Those two simple words, uttered by a tiny, trembling voice, had transformed the courtroom. They had reminded everyone that bravery is not measured by size, that innocence can convey truth more powerfully than years of training, and that compassion, when paired with courage, can shape even the most rigid structures of law. And so, as the courtroom settled into the rhythm of the day's proceedings, the memory of those two words lingered like a quiet echo, a reminder of the smallest witness who had left the entire room in tears. The courtroom settled into a rhythm, though the memory of the little girl's two words, "bad man," lingered in the air like a heartbeat that refused to fade. Every adult in the room carried the weight of her courage, her innocence, and down the quiet power she had summoned. Judges, lawyers, jurors, and townspeople alike had been touched in ways that no legal procedure could measure. Those two words had reframed the entire trial, transforming it from a technical proceeding into a moment of profound human connection. The little girl sat quietly, her hands resting on the dog's soft fur. He remained her anchor, steady and calm, as if he understood that this day would shape not only her future, but the perception of justice in the entire courtroom. Her guardian knelt beside her, whispering gentle words of encouragement, while the dog's presence radiated reassurance that only someone who had been through every step of her fear could provide. The prosecutor cleared his throat softly. His usually commanding voice was tempered with care as he addressed the courtroom. "We have heard the testimony," he said, glancing toward the child, "and we recognize the bravery it has taken to provide it. In this case, the evidence presented, including the courage of our smallest witness, is compelling. The truth has been spoken, and it will guide our judgment." The defense attorney, who had initially approached the case with professional detachment, now appeared visibly humbled. He straightened in his seat, his hands resting lightly on his notebook. "While we remain bound to procedure," he said, his voice softer than usual, "we cannot ignore the clarity and honesty of the testimony we have just witnessed. It is evident that the court has heard the truth from the most sincere source possible." The judge's eyes softened as he observed the little girl. His gavel, typically a symbol of authority, seemed almost ceremonial now, marking not just legal procedure, but acknowledgement of bravery. He addressed the jury with quiet solemnity. "Members of the jury, what we have seen today is more than evidence. It is courage, it is honesty, It is the voice of a child who has been given a chance to be heard. Let that guide your deliberations. And let us remember that justice is not only about rules and statutes, it is about truth, compassion, and the human spirit. The jurors, many of whom were parents or grandparents, listened intently. Their earlier anxiety and uncertainty had transformed into resolve. They understood that this case was not just about facts and testimony, but about protecting the vulnerable, honoring honesty, and acknowledging the bravery of a child who had faced unimaginable fear. Their responsibility felt heavier, yet clearer, than ever. The little girl, sensing the shift in energy, shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers still entwined with the dog's fur. She did not fully understand the legal implications of the proceedings, nor did she need to. What she did understand was that the courtroom, once a place of fear, had become a space where her voice mattered. That realization, though quiet and unspoken, brought a faint smile to her face. As deliberations continued, the courtroom waited with bated breath. The townspeople, who had filled the gallery for weeks leading up to the trial, remained silent but vigilant, feeling the weight of history in the making. Reporters took careful notes, mindful of the child's presence and the extraordinary circumstances. And through it all, the dog remained beside her, a steadfast companion, reminding everyone that the truth often requires courage, trust, and support. Hours passed. The courtroom felt suspended in a state of anticipation. Every small sound, the shuffle of papers, the scratching of pens, the soft breaths of those seated felt magnified. Then, at last, the foreperson of the jury rose, carrying the collective decision that had been shaped not only by evidence, but by the emotional resonance of a child's testimony. "We, the jury," the foreperson began, voice steady yet solemn, "find the defendant guilty on all counts. This verdict acknowledges not only the evidence presented, but the bravery and honesty of the child who testified today. We commend the courage she has shown and recognize that her voice, though small in size, has carried the weight of truth and justice." A wave of relief and emotion swept through the courtroom. Some jurors wept quietly. Parents in the gallery clutched their children closer. Even the attorneys allowed themselves subtle nods of recognition. And the judge, his eyes misty, rapped the gavel lightly, not to demand order, but to seal the acknowledgement of justice earned through courage and truth. The little girl, hearing the verdict, blinked slowly. She did not fully understand the legal terminology, nor the implications of the judgment. What she did understand, with the clarity of her innocence, was that the people around her had listened. They had heard her words. They had believed her. And in that belief, she found validation, protection, and hope. Her guardian pulled her close, whispering soft congratulations. The child hugged the dog tightly, pressing her face against his head in a mixture of relief, love, and gratitude. The dog rested calmly, knowing that the mission he had silently carried out, the unwavering support and comfort of a frightened child, was complete. Together, they had navigated fear, uncertainty, and trauma to reach a place of safety and acknowledgement. The courtroom slowly emptied, the townspeople lingering for moments longer than necessary, unwilling to leave the emotional intensity behind. Conversations were hushed, reflective, and full of reverence for the child's courage. Teachers spoke quietly to parents about the importance of fostering resilience. Clergy nodded thoughtfully, reminded of the innocence and strength inherent in children. The entire community felt the ripple effect of what had transpired inside those oak-paneled walls. Outside, the town seemed to exhale collectively. Word of the verdict and the child's bravery spread quickly, carried in hushed tones and whispered admiration. Neighbors who had not attended the trial discussed the courage of a 3-year-old who had spoken truth in a world that often demands more than innocence can provide. Children in the streets were held a little closer, as if the community now understood the fragility and strength intertwined in young lives. The little girl, now safely outside the courtroom with her guardian, looked up at the sky, her hands still resting on the dog's fur. She did not speak of victory or judgment, for she did not yet know such concepts fully. But she smiled, a small, quiet smile that carried the weight of triumph over fear, of courage exercised in its purest form. The dog nudged her gently, and she hugged him, knowing that together they had crossed an invisible threshold from fear into safety. In the weeks that followed, the story of the courtroom, the verdict, and the little girl's courage became a symbol in the town. Teachers, parents, and community leaders referred to it as a reminder that truth and justice often depend not on the loudest voices, but on the most vulnerable, bravely speaking what others may overlook. The dog, too, became a local hero, his calm presence forever associated with the power of empathy, trust, and support. And for the little girl, life slowly regained a sense of normalcy. She played, laughed, and explored the world around her. Still small, still innocent, but now with the knowledge that her voice mattered. The trauma she had experienced did not vanish, but the courtroom had proven to her that she was heard, that she was valued, and that even in the face of fear, courage can create real, lasting change. The bond between her and the dog endured. Beyond the trial, he continued to be her companion, protector, and silent confidant, reminding her that love and trust could survive even the darkest moments. Together, they became symbols not just of survival, but of triumph, the ability of innocence, courage, and compassion to affect the world profoundly. In the end, the courthouse returned to its usual quiet routine, but the story of that day lingered in its walls. Lawyers and judges, jurors and townspeople, all carried the memory of a 3-year-old child whose courage transformed a courtroom, whose simple words, 2 tiny words, spoke louder than any testimony ever could. The trial had ended, but the lesson remained. Justice is not merely about law, it is about humanity. And the smallest witness, with her faithful companion by her side, had reminded everyone who witnessed her bravery that innocence and courage, when combined, could shape the course of justice, heal wounds, and inspire generations to come.